Today we're going to talk about writing about literature. Writing about literature, it's not very different from other forms of academic writing, but there are some specific things we're going to talk about it, especially about fiction. So the examples are going to be from stories that we read in the course. So one of the first things we have to acknowledge about writing is that it's difficult. You have to think, you have to concentrate, you have to produce something new. There's a lot of worries and anxieties about writing. But one of the things that helps us to write is to know the structures and have some kind of recurring process that we can undergo in order to improve our writing and produce more writing. This is a lifelong task. As long as you're going to be an academic, a writer, anything like that, you're going to improve and better your skills all the time, and you're all going to be teaching writing and be expected to write to some extent in your everyday job. So it's good to practice writing. And today we are going to talk about writing about literature. This is relevant to a lot of the classwork that you're going to do for the rest of the semester, but also for the entirety of your academic career in the college, as long as you'll be writing about literature. And my ambition is that I'm going to meet all of you again, or some of you at least again, in next year or in 2 years or 3 years, and you'll be writing a 20-page seminar with me, and you'll have these skills just the same way as you're writing one paragraph for this course, you're going to write 20 pages. Okay? So the question for today is, what do you do when you get a question like this? What's the significance of the yellow wallpaper in the story The Yellow Wallpaper? Quite general, there can be a number of answers, but what do you do with this question, right? Write a paragraph about this question. Or, what is the main social conflict in the sacrificial egg? Why do the townspeople ignore Miss Emily's crime for so long despite the evidence? What is the role of anti-Semitism in the Jew bird? All of these are questions about interpretation. You might even at one point get something like, write a short essay about Pride and Prejudice. Where do you begin? What do you do? So I'm not going to answer those questions. I'm going to try to answer, what do you do when you're asked such questions? So by the end of this class, you'll be more acquainted with the writing process for writing about literature. You know the structure of an argument paragraph, and you'll have some words and phrases that you can use within those paragraphs, kind of markers that will help you make sure that it's clear where we are at with your paragraphs. Okay, so I'm going to teach you a process and some basic tools for carrying out this process. So whenever we talk about teaching writing, we have to teach two different things. The product, how the final product, how the final essay, or how the final letter, or how the finalized paragraph is going to look, and we're going to teach the process. What are the steps through which the writing will be carried out? Okay, because we might know the final product, we might read a novel, but that doesn't mean that we know the steps through which people went in order to write said novel. So this is basically what we're going to talk about in this class. First, I'm going to talk about the structure of the paragraph, and then I'm going to talk about the process. Okay, some of these things are going to be repeated twice because in order to understand what you're supposed to do in the process, you need to know the end result that you want. Okay, so we're going to start with paragraph structure. Top 5 or top 4+1 basic components of the paragraph. Okay, I'm going to break this down. Thesis statement, evidence, analysis of the evidence and conclusion, a restriction on the thesis or an explanation for it. This is basically the most important thing you need to have in your paragraph. This is what your paragraph is about, and not only what your paragraph is about, but what you're going to say in that paragraph. What is it that you're going to argue? What am I going to be convinced of by the end of the paragraph? You are pretending to be a lawyer. You're stating, my client is innocent, and now you're going to prove it. But first you have to say, my client is innocent. This is what is true about the story. This is the interesting interpretation of the story. This is the argument that you must make. It's what you're going to convince us of in the paragraph. This has to be the first line, to announce to the readers, this is why it's worthwhile reading the paragraph, and this is the idea that you have to pay attention to throughout the paragraph. Stating it outright really helps understand your paragraph, and that's our ultimate goal here, to write clear paragraphs. The next sentence or two, or it can be the part of the first sentence, is more optional. Sometimes we make a very big argument, and then we have to break it down and restrict it. So even if you say, my client is innocent, you might say, my client is innocent, but only through these two crimes. Or my argument is that the wallpaper represents something, but only in the context of the ending of the story. I'll give you an example of this later. Or sometimes you have to explain your thesis more. So you might need to define a term or give some kind of context. What else people need to know to even start to understand your argument? Okay, and this depends on who you're stating to. A lot of people have the tendency to give this extra explanation before the thesis, right? Explain what the metaphor is before we can say that the yellow wallpaper is a metaphor. Sort of get it out of the way. Finish your explanation and only then make an argument. Okay, I understand why this makes sense to some of you, but the main thing for easy structure for your readers to understand is to know what you are arguing first, and then you can give the extra context, the extra explanations for what that thesis is. Now here's an example of a thesis. This thesis is a little too general. The wallpaper represents control over women. Okay, control over women, that's such a big topic. We need to restrict it maybe in order to say something specific about the story. What kind of control over women? It's better to rewrite it in a way that's more specific. In the yellow wallpaper, the wallpaper represents how society and especially men restrict women's freedom. Okay, so yes, society restricts women's freedom, not only controls them, but restricts their freedom. You could even add of movement, and especially men. Add some restrictions to your argument. It's not just society, especially women. Yes, especially men. Society in general, but also more specific. So you can even add the restriction to the same in the story, and this would be, the next sentence would be additional explanation and additional restrictions. In the story, much of this restriction of freedom is expressed in lack of freedom of movement, right? Not just any kind of freedom, not freedom of thought, not freedom of the press, freedom of movement, not being able to go out of the house. The main character is not allowed to move out of the room. She hates or leave the house earlier than the the planned date, right? I'm already starting to restrict it by giving the context of the story, right? This information is not about the wallpaper, but it is about giving context and explanation for the story. Sort of, this is something you should know about the story before I can continue addressing the wallpaper. A lot of you would want to say, in the yellow wallpaper, she's not allowed to leave the house, and only then give the thesis about the wallpaper itself. No, you want to say what the argument is. The next part of the paragraph would be evidence. Okay, this is evidence that supports your thesis, that supports your argument. This is the proof that what you are saying is correct. When we're talking about literature and fiction, often the evidence is going to be a quote from the text, something that the text says and proves what you are saying about the text. But sometimes it's going to be some kind of other fact or about the text. It's the setting that you don't want to necessarily quote the place where it says it. You just say it's in an old house. Or a plot line. You have to say there's a murder in the background. You don't have to quote the whole paragraph about the murder. Now, it's very important to be selective with your evidence. Don't quote the whole story. Don't quote the whole poem. Choose the lines that are really evidence for your argument. Not interesting lines, not funny lines, and not just from the first word of the paragraph to the end of the paragraph. Choose the evidence that actually supports. This is one of the difference between a good paragraph and a very good paragraph. In a very good paragraph, the evidence is exactly what you need. Not too much, not too little. Don't forget to introduce the quote. So you can use phrases like as the narrator says, as John says, as John writes, as we can see in the text, and then bring in the quote. Sometimes you're going to need to give some context. Towards the ending of the story, in the opening paragraphs of the story, just after John leaves, just before John comes into her room, when the narrator is already seeing things. Just give us the idea of where the quote is coming from. Don't just count on the quote itself. Sometimes you need to situate it so we can understand it, especially who's saying it. It's very important. If the narrator is saying it, say the narrator is saying it. So here is an example. The story goes on and the narrator loses touch with reality, giving the context of the plot. She starts to see a woman's figure behind the pattern of the wallpaper, and then directly where the quote is coming from. Little after the figure first appears, she writes, "The faint figure behind seemed to shake the pattern, just as if she wanted to get out." Okay, so this is our evidence, and I situate it in the story. Piece of the text, which is not very short and not very long. It's a sentence, but it's not a whole paragraph. This is my evidence. This is what I have to work with in order to prove my point. Analysis of the evidence. It really explains to us why you brought in this evidence. Why is this evidence supporting your thesis? Okay, the evidence supports the thesis, and the analysis of the evidence supports why the evidence supports the thesis. You have to explain to your reader why this is useful for understanding your argument. Why is this useful and important for being convinced by your argument? You have a number of markers that you can use in order to introduce your analysis, your reading of the evidence. Now, sometimes you can just have it straight away after the quote and one understands that this is analysis, but if you want to mark it, there are plenty of ways. The importance of X is the significance that this X signifies, therefore, thus. mark that this is your interpretation. And sometimes you'll have to bring some evidence, interpret it, bring some more evidence, and interpret it. For instance, if you're discussing a process, then you'll have evidence from the beginning of the story and then evidence from the end of the story. So you don't have to smash all of them together. You can bring the evidence from the beginning, interpret it, and then go back to evidence and analysis. Evidence analysis, all this in the same paragraph. That said, usually you would have one or two sets of evidence analysis pairs in a paragraph. If you need more evidence, then you need another paragraph. And then maybe your argument, you have to ask, maybe my argument is too big, or maybe I'm bringing too much evidence. Maybe I already proved my point and I don't need to bring any more evidence. So, as an example for analysis, the figure behind the pattern can remind us of a prisoner in a jail or cage. If the reader views the pattern in this slide, it is similar to prison bars that restrict the woman's figure's movement, right? The pattern is prison bars. The shaking movement is important because it dramatizes how badly she wants to get out, making it more urgent. I give a close reading of the sentence that I quoted. The pattern is similar to a bar. I explain why there's shaking. Okay, give ideas, give a deeper understanding of the evidence that you have, but always in a way that connects back to the thesis. And the fifth and final classic part of a paragraph is a conclusion. Now, if you're writing just one paragraph, all you do in the conclusion is say your argument again, state your thesis again, with more confidence and in other words, to make sure that people know what you just argued. Why do you have to repeat it? Because people have lousy memories and you have to remind them. If you're writing something longer, then the conclusion reminds them of what the paragraph did and leads up to the next paragraph. And the conclusion is there to remind your reader what you just said and also to make your argument more convincing. There are a number of ways to introduce a conclusion. The classic one is in conclusion or to conclude. Don't mix those two up. Don't say on conclusion. You can say finally or thus and therefore. Thus and therefore means what I'm going to say now comes directly from what I said earlier. So that's the conclusion. What I'm saying now is based on what I just told you. You can also use the thus and therefore to introduce the analysis. So to conclude, the yellow wallpaper's pattern surely holds back a specific woman and therefore represents what holds back all women. Here, this is what I was arguing. This is what the pattern represents, a kind of prison cell. It represents bars, and more generally, it stands for what suppresses women and their freedom of movement. So I say this again as the last sentence. So, to remind you, we covered 5 basic components of the paragraph. Thesis statement, optionally restricting the thesis or explaining it further, evidence, which is not optional, analysis of that evidence, and conclusion. Now we're going to talk about the writing process. Earlier we talked about the completed film, and now I'm going to tell you how to be producers and get somebody to write a script and then film and then edit the film for you. Okay, of course, here you do it all alone. And this is similar to other prescriptions for the writing process, but there are some things that I can say more specifically about writing about literature. rather than talking generally about how to write. So some of the stages are going to be unique for writing about literature, but they'll correspond to stages you might know from other ways of writing. So first of all, you read the text, then you think up ideas, then you do close reading as a way of finding evidence. Then you write the first version of your paragraph and then you revise it and finalize it, making it more clear and readable. I cannot emphasize this more. The first thing you have to do when you get a question about a text is to read it. Now, if you just read it, you can skip this stage, but you have to read the text even before you start thinking, even before you start thinking about what you want to say about it. Read it all the way through. Know the text as well as you can. Okay, even not necessarily thinking in terms of close reading, just having an acquaintance with the text. So usually for class assignments, you just read it and we read it together. So we're doing that stage. The next stage is to think up ideas. Knowing the story, right? Don't think about ideas about the story without knowing it. Writing about literature means about a specific text. So with the text in mind, think about ideas and what it is you want to argue. And the general advice for this stage is try not to be overly critical of yourself. Try to throw out ideas, even bad ones. Then after you have a number of ideas, you can choose the best one. What is important is not just to go with the first idea that you have. If you have anything like more than an hour, give your brain time to go over the question. Come up with at least 2-3 possibilities, and then choose the one that's going to give you the strongest paragraph, the strongest argument. Okay, you don't necessarily have to formulate it the best way right now, but have a number of options, even if some of them are bad ones. How do you do that? No, you can just give your mind time to think by doing the dishes, taking a shower, going on a walk without checking your phone all the time. You can sit down with a piece of paper and jot down ideas. There's this technique of free writing where you have to write straight through for 2-3 minutes, thinking about the question. Whatever comes into your mind, you write it down without any criticism of yourself, without any self-censorship. Just write it down, and then ideas are going to come up, and some silly things are going to come up as well. But by the end of that writing process, you're going to, you made your brain work, right? It's difficult to come up with ideas because the brain thinks about a million different things. And a lot of time that thing is, I wonder what's happening on Facebook. I wonder what's for dinner. And when you concentrate for 2 minutes on writing or on putting down ideas or on doing something that does not allow you to think about other things, and then ideas come up. And of course, you can talk with friends, not necessarily people who are in the same class or know the story. Find somebody who lives with you and tell them, we read this story. I have to answer this question. And by talking and explaining to somebody who actually didn't read the story, you might come up with a good idea. And by the end of the process, you know, if this is going to be a book you're writing, this brainstorming process can take weeks, months. If this is one paragraph, this should take 15 minutes tops, or a little more if you're taking a walk. But by the end of this, you should have a list of a number of possible arguments, and then you can pick the best one, the one that most that is most interesting, that is most rich, the one that's interesting for you. 5 minutes to brainstorm an idea. Use one of these techniques, do some dishes. So by the end of the process, you should have a list of ideas that answer the question, what is the significance of the yellow wallpaper in the story? Welcome back. Now we have a list of possibilities. How do you choose? How do you choose the best thesis or argument for your paragraph? It's going to be more productive. Okay. So some of this is going to be personal, what your opinion is or what kind of argument you prefer to make. But I can give you some general guidelines. You don't want the thesis to be too general or vague. You want it to say something specific, and it should be about the text. Women are oppressed by modern society is not such a good thesis for this paragraph, because you want to talk about the story. That thesis doesn't talk about the story. It talks about society in general. Even first-person narrators are often unreliable. That's also not the best thesis for this kind of writing, because you want to be more specific. This narrator is unreliable. Okay, again, not something that you could say about any text. You want there to be specificity. You want there to be something unique about this text that you're bringing forward. On the other hand, you want it to be something that you can prove, that you think you should be able to find evidence for. So if it's something that is too out there, too idiosyncratic, too personal to you, too much of a personal association, for instance, somebody raised the idea of the egg being connected to the Easter egg. Okay, maybe you can prove it, but I'm not sure. So you have to ask yourself, is this something that's just my sort of general association, or is this relevant to the story, and is this something I will be able to convince somebody else to believe as well? And finally, it does need to be an argument that needs to be proven. So on the one hand, you want it to be something you can prove. On the other hand, you want it to be something you need to prove. If it's something that's obvious and nobody would ever argue against that point, nobody could possibly bring any other option. For instance, the narrator of the Yellow Wallpaper is a woman. That's a bad thesis for the paragraph, because probably nobody would ever argue with that point. There's just too much evidence for it. So you want something that's not automatically obvious. You want something that you need to prove to me, to prove to your reader. Now, this is one of the challenges, and I try to give you questions where there is more than one possible answer, so you can come up with a thesis that does need proving, that is not obvious, right? I'm not asking you what is the gender of the narrator in the Yellow Wallpaper. I'm not asking you, I don't know, where does the sacrificial egg take place. It says so. You don't need a whole paragraph in order to discuss this question. I'll show you a list of possible theses for the question about the wallpaper, and maybe you want to pause the video and look at them and think which of them, there is more than one, which of them has potential for a whole paragraph that's not trivial, not obvious, but could be proved. So let's go through them. The wallpaper is the symbol of madness. Okay, this has potential. It stands for her madness. We can find evidence for it, but it's not automatically right. It's not automatic. We have to make these connections. Wallpapers are not obviously connected to madness. Even in the story, we have to explain how exactly. So you have space to develop it. The wallpaper really is the cause of the madness. This you really will need to prove it, right? Because the natural thing for us to do is to assume that she loses her mind for her own personal psychological reasons, and because she stands and because she is made to stay at home all the time. So if you want to think about the wallpaper as the cause of madness, you'll have to make an argument. I'm not sure you could, because there are different reasons that make a lot more sense for her madness. The wallpaper represents control over women. Okay. Again, not obvious. Why would the wallpaper be control over women? So we can develop it, and you saw me developing it earlier. The wallpaper gives her ideas about how to take control over her life. Okay, this is interesting. It's actually the opposite of the thesis I developed, but I think you could find evidence for that, right? Because the women escape, at the end of the story, the women escape the pattern and crawl outside of the wallpaper. So maybe there's something liberating about looking at the wallpaper, but you'll have to develop it. And it's actually the opposite argument from what I said before, that it represents the control over women. You could combine these arguments, but you see that you could have an argument. No, this is about controlling women. No, this is about liberating women. You could actually have, no, I use the word argument as something that one person writes, but an argument is also two people speaking with each other. So this could be an argument in that sense. The wallpaper changes its meaning throughout the story. Okay, yeah, that's probably true, but it's very vague, right? You're not saying something about what its meaning is. You're saying something about how it functions. So if you want to develop this into a thesis, you have to say, yes, in the beginning it represents this, in the middle it represents this, in the ending it represents something different. So you'll probably need a longer essay. And just saying it changes its meaning, that's too vague, too general. The wallpaper is just a decoration. First, it's a little boring, just saying doesn't mean anything. That's not a very good way to start your paragraph. And also, it's probably not true about this specific story. The wallpaper represents the narrator's love for her children. Okay, if you could prove that, it would be super interesting, but I'm not sure that the story has any evidence to support the connection between love and the wallpaper, or maternal love and the wallpaper. If you could find evidence for that, it would be a super good paragraph, because it shows something that's not obvious at all. So you have to find a kind of middle ground between something that is too straightforward and something that is so out there that you're not going to be able to prove it from the story, because you want your thesis to make sense, to be convincing as well, not just surprising, but also convincing. Judging what the best argument or thesis is for you is a skill you develop over many assignments, months and years writing about literature. But the point is that if you don't have the general argument, the rest of the process will not work out very well. It's the foundation of the rest of the project, The next stage is close reading. Now, this is a different kind of close reading than the one we practiced earlier in the semester, where you just open things up. The earlier part of close reading can be a part of the brainstorming process, but once you have a thesis you want to argue for, you want to do, as Lisa does, serious research and find evidence for your argument in the text. So you're close reading, but with a purpose. You're looking for good quotes, good elements of the story to help you prove your argument. Now, if it's just a paragraph, you need a sentence or two. If you're writing something longer, you'll want evidence from throughout the story. So the fourth stage is drafting. Now, the secret to drafting well is to remember that it's just the first draft. It's just something you do, and you're not going to show it to anyone. It's the first run from which you're going to develop and finalize and edit. Okay, if it's not perfect, that's fine, as long as it's on the page. You have the draft. It should already be more or less in the structure that we know. There are things I want you not to worry about. You don't have to worry about grammar mistakes and spelling mistakes, right? If you stop at every word that you want to use and check if the spelling is correct, you won't have flow. You won't, the quotes are too short or too long, if the sentences are too long or too short, and even you don't have to worry if the paragraph is going overboard, right? You do want it to be as long as it's supposed to be, but if you're writing too much, that's fine. You can always delete. And you have a chance to edit it and redo it and add things when you look at it again. Just like I'm making these videos, I can say silly things and then I tell myself, no, that was silly, and then I take it out in the video editing process, which is very, very different from standing in front of the class and talking, and sometimes I say something I'm not happy with, and then I have to go back and say, no, that's not exactly what I meant. When I'm doing these videos, I can just edit them. And when you're doing writing, unless you only have 30 minutes to write, so this is a process. You always have time to edit and redo and rewrite and ask yourself, is this clear? So do make sure when you're writing the draft that you do have all the components of the paragraph. So do already bring in the evidence, do give analysis, have a conclusion. Your aim here is to make the draft as readable and clear as possible to other people. That's the last stage, turning something that was private writing, something that you did as kind of planning for yourself, into something that's communication. So ask yourself, what's the main question that you're asking while you're revising? The main question is, will my reader understand this? Will the reader understand what I'm trying to say? Is this clear? It's very good to take some time off between doing the draft and doing the revising. So even if this is something that you only have a week to do, take a day. If it's something that you have 6 months to do, take a month. Try to put some distance between yourself and the writing, and then you become another reader, right? Often happens to me that I'm reading something that I wrote a month ago and I say, what did I mean? So if I can't even figure out what I mean, then my readers have no chance. So I have to rewrite it and try to remember what I meant, or just delete it because it doesn't make sense. That's the question you have to ask of the paragraph as a whole, and each and every sentence. Is this clear? Would a reader who's not inside my head understand what I wanted to say. Do your best. When this project has higher stakes, it's really worthwhile asking a friend to read it too and see if they understand, right? So you can break up the revising stages into like more content revising, is this clear, and more technical revising, where you ask, is the language correct? Do I have any spelling mistakes? Is this the paragraph structure that I'm expected to use? Really go again and look. Do I have a thesis? Do I have any evidence? Do I analyze the evidence in a way that supports the thesis? And did I forget? Make sure that the quotes are accurate, that you didn't misquote the text. You can also ask, are my sentences too long? Many student writers have a tendency to write very long sentences that fuse together different ideas or different parts of an idea. It's better to break down into more simple sentences than have two very long ones that are difficult to follow. On the other hand, if all the sentences are just 4 words long or 5 words long, it feels very choppy. So that's not the best solution either. So ask yourself, do I need to break up some of these sentences? Do I need to join up some sentences? That makes the writing clearer, especially when you don't have a lot of time. Ask yourself, did I just repeat myself in order to get a paragraph into writing? Maybe you need to delete some of it. If you're just saying the same thing in many sentences and it doesn't add too much to the meaning of your paragraph, it's better to have a shorter paragraph, but not to repeat yourself again and again. The one thing is that the conclusion is a kind of repetition of the thesis. And even in the analysis, you're going to look back at the quotes and at the evidence and at the thesis, and in order to show that you prove this thesis. So it's not like you're not supposed to repeat yourself at all, but sometimes students tend just to write the same sentence over and over again until they get it right, but then not delete the other sentences that weren't exactly right. Last question for now. Do I have any information or evidence that's redundant, that doesn't help my argument? You don't have to start telling the whole story of the whole plot of the story you're discussing if only one part of it is relevant. Or you don't have to explain what a narrator is just because you're discussing, or what the first person narrator is, if you're just discussing symbolism in the yellow wallpaper. And part of showing good writing and intelligence in writing is knowing what's relevant and what's irrelevant for the evidence, for extra information, for terms. Everything is up to your judgment, and knowing what helps your argument along and what's just fluff, just distracting from your argument. Again, this, you practice it and you get better at it, and you get comments from teachers and other people, and you learn from it. Nobody's born with these skills. One of my most important aims as a teacher of literature is to improve these writing and judgment skills. I really recommend keeping a list of the kind of things you get comments on. So if I wrote to you that you bury your thesis, right? If the thesis is in the middle of the paragraph instead of the beginning, have that in your list. And every time you have some writing to do, ask yourself, is the thesis at the beginning of the paragraph or not? Check. Okay, I remember this. And then after revising, you're finished. Mazal tov, congratulations, you can submit it. Okay, so you have a class assignment to write a paragraph. Now, even if you already did all your class assignment, I really recommend doing this. As I said throughout the class, writing is a skill you have to practice. the more you practice, the better you are. So having the process, having the routine, having the structure that's really burned into your mind, so you know how to approach these questions, is very important. Exam will be exactly this kind of write a paragraph question and write a well-structured paragraph about answering those questions. So you have to pick a argument and build a paragraph around it, and it should have the structure that we discussed. If you need to, so it should have the thesis. If you need some restriction or explanation, evidence, analysis, and a conclusion. So the first one is about the yellow wallpaper. Uh, and it's a question that we didn't really discuss. So this is really independent thinking and independent writing. So towards the end of the yellow wallpaper, John faints. What do you think this event represents? Why would Gilman include it in the story, or why? How does the narrator describe it? Okay, why is it there? How is it depicted? Why would you have the husband faint at the end of the story? That's one question. The other one is about the sacrificial egg, and it is about things that we did discuss in the story. In the sacrificial egg, what is Julius Obi's approach to old African religion and beliefs? To what extent does it change in the course of the story? Notice that this is a question about change, so you'll probably need evidence from different parts of the story. And you'll remember that in terms of the timeline, it's a kind of a circular timeline because it begins at the end of the story, goes back to the past, and then ends again in the office with the market. Okay, so those are the assignments. Do one of them, and I'll give you more essay writing practice when we discuss Pride and Prejudice. And the final exam itself is going to ask you to write one paragraph like this about Pride and Prejudice, about a chapter that we're not going to discuss together. Okay, thank you for listening. Bye bye.